we'll look at next is our data flow product. What's the simplest set of options, and then we'll do all the hard work of actually making it work in the back end inside of Azure, just trying to make, that technology more accessible, or any technology really. So what I'm going to do is create for us a quick test flow. And what this is going to do is it's actually going to reach into our Azure environment. And even if it was infrastructure, so it's a separate workflow where you could basically attach to an already existing resource group out inside of Azure if you've already done a bunch of legwork and trying to get that, your own stuff working. So what we're doing is we're actually reading the infrastructure that we have decided to read. And right now in our simplest setup, we're kind of seeing the event hub as a data stream, the IoT hub as a device stream, cold storage represents a blob, warm storage is a Cosmos DB, but more specifically, it's actually reading table or container level data. So if there were multiple containers, there would be multiple warm storage locations that you could write to. Hot storage is an Azure queue. And then we've got these other sort of support controls. In other packages, we also can support things like machine learning and AI so that they become infrastructure that you can kind of drag onto the screen. But we didn't provision any of that, so it's not going to show up here. And so what we can do is, rather than knowing anything about what I actually have to do to connect these technologies in a scalable way, I can drag on an event hub, and I'm going to use an event hub instead of an IoT hub because we'll just emulate some data today on the demo. Oh, that's not what I want. And then, like you were talking about, we're actually dragging some arrows and we're saying, let's connect our event hub into a map because we want to kind of map this to some new locations. Say we want to write it to our cold storage, so we can connect our map to our cold storage. We want to do our warm storage. And now when you open the settings for the map, and we won't have time to demo that today, but you can actually kind of map the schema of data, change it, translate it, and even bring in API calls so that you can kind of augment data streams as well, using kind of a no-code tool set. And so, here we have kind of our basic IoT setup in terms of what we think is necessary to kind of engage and start in, developing an IoT idea and strategy. We've got an event hub connecting through an Azure Stream Analytics job, which obviously we can't see, but that's what we'll provision here in just a minute. And that Azure Stream Analytics job is going to write out to cold, warm, and hot storage locations. Before we provision, though, having that flow is nice, but let's actually add some data that we'll be able to see across it. So I'm going to bring in an emulator. Out of the box, our emulator emulates a company that we work with, data, which is a dog wearable. And so it's going to have temperature, step count, and some lat long data that we're emulating out of here. We're going to connect that to our data ingest. And then lastly, just so we can show some other things here about the way we can kind of orchestrate, Azure and these different open source and our own tools. So now we've got the warm query. Oops, I got to rename that. And we'll drag from our warm over to our query. Now we can save that configuration. And then I'm going to click the provisioning button over here. And what that's going to do is go out and actually start to code into your Azure world the services necessary to actually make that entire flow happen. So it's going to provision an Azure Stream Analytics job and write all of the queries necessary, set up the inputs and outputs. They've got to know a lot about the inputs, the outputs, and the query language to be able to write it into all of these things. We're kind of doing that in a no-code way to where we're taking your configuration and deploying it out to that world. The emulators that we saw in the query are going to be provisioned as Azure functions. And we can see here, the ASA job is here. And if we look at that, we'll see, the inputs set up, the outputs set up. And then you can see right here, we're starting to pull together a consumption plan to release your first initial Azure functions to. So really just trying to take the developer and architects out of, the responsibility of learning all of that stuff. Then there's our functions starting to get created inside of here. And you can see here, right, we've got actual data already flowing through here because we created that emulator. But we've also then, right, created these functions for you. And again, there's times in our tooling, right, you can use no-code tools to develop functions, but we're also working on bringing in IDEs so that you can do actual function development if you don't like what our, out-of-the-box emulator capability is. But we've actually created actual functions for you. This is a timer trigger function, which you can see right here, which I'm sure you're familiar with. And this is what we call our emulator function. And you can see right here, we're just emulating a payload of data, setting a device count. So we could come in here and set it to 500 if we wanted to 10,000 if we wanted to. We can push these functions out to edge devices and things like that as well. This one's going to be running in the cloud instead of that. And then, you could pick any payload. Our UI allows you to kind of pick the schema, again, kind of apply a schema. And then we've got some different things you can do to randomize the different data that you're trying to work with. And then in addition to that, we've also built a HTTP trigger function that's just going to do a pass through of all documents currently inside of our telemetry device, right? And so, developers didn't have to know that. They didn't have to know how to come in here and, configure these inputs and these outputs and, all of these different things. And then again, this is just reading all telemetry data. We've pre-configured that telemetry container inside of Cosmos. We want to store everything in cold storage. We want to stream everything through hot flow. But with warm storage, that container is actually pre-configured with a TTL of 7 days. So it only keeps, by default, the last 7 days of telemetry data. This map tool is what would allow you to, change a TTL of something that's coming through if you wanted it to last longer or shorter. Or you could change the actual container inside the infrastructure blade if you wanted a default TTL different to 7 days. So there's the other thing we're doing is kind of looking at different metrics across these services. We actually pull those into a single view for you. And right here, we're seeing what we consider what we think you should be looking at to make sure that things are running good, right? Just kind of protecting you from having to go dive around the Azure portal looking for all of that information.